In the dim glow of a gray dawn, the cobbled streets of a small medieval village are already stirring with whispers. A rumor carried like wildfire spreads from door to door. A woman has been caught in the act of adultery. It is not just any scandal. In the Middle Ages, adultery is more than a personal betrayal. It is a crime that strikes at the heart of social order, family honor, and the moral fabric woven by religion and law. For a woman, the consequences are particularly severe. Men might face a fine, a brief imprisonment, or even forgiveness from the church, but a woman accused of adultery is often treated as if she has shattered the sanctity of the entire community. And for her, the punishment is not designed merely to correct her behavior. It is meant to destroy her public image, to strip her of dignity, and brand her as a living example of shame. In medieval Europe, punishment was rarely private. Justice, in the eyes of both the church and the local authorities, had to be a public spectacle. The purpose was twofold: to cleanse the community of the sin and to warn everyone else not to commit the same crime. Adultery, being both a moral and legal offense, attracted punishments that were deeply humiliating. Among these, one stands out as particularly cruel and theatrical: shaving the head of the accused, stripping them, and parading them through the streets for all to see. It was not enough to imprison or fine them. Society needed to see the sinner brought low, her beauty and pride destroyed before the crowd. The act of shaving a woman's head carried enormous symbolic weight in medieval culture. Hair was seen as a mark of femininity, virtue, and even sexuality. For a woman to appear with her hair cut off was to declare her dishonor to the world. Monks and nuns shaved their heads as a sign of humility and submission to God. But for a woman accused of adultery, the same act became a form of enforced disgrace. Her once flowing hair, perhaps braided and perfumed, would be hacked away with shears or knives in front of her neighbors, leaving her exposed and marked as unclean. The sight alone sent shivers through the crowd. Here was a woman who had dared to defy the sacred vows of marriage, now reduced to nothing but a cautionary tale. Let us imagine the moment. She is dragged from the house in the early hours of the morning, when the marketplace is beginning to fill. Her lover, if captured, is often treated differently, sometimes fined or quietly punished. But the woman bears the brunt of the spectacle. Guards grip her by the arms, forcing her into the square where a wooden stool has been set up. A man with a grim face, perhaps the village executioner or an official barber, steps forward with shears. The crowd gathers, men, women, even children. Some faces burn with curiosity, others with judgment. As her hair falls to the ground in uneven clumps, she can feel their eyes piercing her skin, stripping her soul as much as the blades strip her hair. But this is only the beginning. In many medieval towns, shaving the head was a prelude to something far worse: the public parade. The woman, often wearing nothing more than a thin shift or sometimes stripped completely naked, would be bound or roped and marched through the streets. Bells might be rung to call the villagers out, ensuring everyone witnessed her humiliation. In some places, she was forced to carry symbols of her sin: a wooden heart split in two, or a sign that read "Adulteress" in crude letters. The public shaming was a form of execution without death. It killed her reputation, her marriage, and her standing in society. Why such cruelty? To understand this, we must look at the values of medieval Europe. marriage was not only a personal contract, but a social and religious covenant. Breaking it was considered an offense not just against a spouse, but against God, the church, and the community at large. Women, in particular, were expected to embody chastity and obedience. A woman who strayed was seen as a threat to the bloodlines, inheritance, and moral order of her family. Punishing her harshly was thought to restore balance and cleanse the dishonor she had brought upon her household. In France during the 14th century, records describe numerous cases where women accused of adultery were subjected to public humiliation. Chroniclers wrote of wives being paraded through the streets with shaved heads, sometimes with their faces blackened with soot, to make them look ugly and sinful. In Germany, some towns had laws that required an adulterous woman to walk barefoot, wearing only a linen undergarment through the main square, while people jeered and threw mud or rotten vegetables. In Italy, particularly in Florence, the practice of infamia was widespread, an official declaration of dishonor that often involved such parades. One particularly haunting story comes from a small town near Paris in the late 1300s. A young noblewoman, the wife of a minor knight, was accused of an affair with a stable hand. When the affair was discovered, her husband refused to kill her, an act some men of higher rank might have chosen, but instead insisted on a punishment of maximum public disgrace. Before the townspeople, she was dragged to the marketplace. Her fine clothes were torn from her, leaving her half naked as the official barber took his shears and cut her hair short, even burning the ends to prevent her from hiding her shame. Then, with a rope tied around her waist, she was marched through every street of the town. Children laughed, women pointed fingers muttering prayers or insults, men sneered. By the time she returned to the marketplace, she was weeping and broken. The stable hand, meanwhile, had been whipped, but was spared the same humiliation. This imbalance between the punishment of men and women was not accidental. Medieval law, influenced by church doctrine, held women to stricter standards of purity. A man could often recover from such a scandal. He might pay a fine or perform a public penance. But a woman, once publicly shamed, rarely regained her standing. Her shaved head was like a brand that could take months, even years, to grow out. And by then, the memory of her disgrace lingered in every whispered conversation. The parade was not always limited to a single offender. There are accounts of adulterous couples being tied together, back to back, and forced to walk through the town while people hurled stones or insults. In some cases, they were made to ride a donkey, facing backward as a symbol of foolishness. Such scenes were designed not only to punish, but to entertain the public, turning personal tragedy into a form of communal theater. To make matters worse, these punishments often came with permanent consequences. In some towns, after the public shaming, the woman would be banished, forced to leave her home, her children, and everything she knew. In other cases, her marriage would be dissolved, leaving her destitute and without protection. For a woman in the Middle Ages, this was effectively a social death sentence. Yet not all women accepted this fate silently. Some tried to fight back, to appeal to local lords or church officials. Records exist of women pleading for mercy, arguing that they had been falsely accused or that their husbands had abandoned them. A few even managed to escape punishment by fleeing to neighboring towns or claiming sanctuary in a church. But these cases were rare most women endured the humiliation because they had no other choice. The image of a woman, head-shaven, walking barefoot and half-naked through a medieval village is not just a scene of personal shame, it is a window into the values and brutality of an era where public reputation meant everything. It reminds us that medieval justice was as much about spectacle as it was about law. The crowd was part of the punishment, feeding off the fear and humiliation of others, reinforcing the power of the authorities. As we look closer into this practice, one question emerges. Were these punishments truly about justice, or were they a form of control, an attempt to keep women subservient and fearful? In the next part of this story, we will dive deeper into the mechanics of these public parades, examining how entire towns participated in the ritual of shaming and the psychological scars it left behind on those who were forced to endure it. The punishment was never just about the act of adultery itself. It was about turning sin into a public spectacle, an event that the entire town could witness, talk about, and remember. In the Middle Ages, justice was deeply tied to community participation. When someone was accused of adultery, especially a woman, the punishment was carefully designed to humiliate her in the most visible way possible. This public shaming took on the form of a parade, often following the brutal ritual of shaving her head. The parade was not a mere walk through the streets. It was a performance meant to engrave fear and moral lessons into the hearts of everyone who saw it. Imagine the scene. The town's bell begins to toll, not for a wedding, not for a mass, but as a signal that someone is about to be paraded for their sins. People abandon their work, children leave their games, merchants pause their trade, all eager to see the spectacle. A wooden cart, or simply a group of guards, pulls the accused woman from the town jail or her own home. She is barefoot, often dressed in nothing more than a ragged shift, or, in the harshest cases, she is stripped entirely, her nakedness adding another layer of humiliation. Her hair, already shorn, exposes her pale scalp to the sun and the mocking gazes of the crowd. The streets are narrow and filled with curious eyes. People lean out of windows. Villagers gather along the route, ready to jeer, laugh, or curse. It is not uncommon for the crowd to be encouraged to throw rotten vegetables, mud, or even stones at the woman as she walks. These objects are not meant to kill, but to add to the degradation. Every splatter of filth, every insult shouted from the sidelines is part of the punishment. This is what medieval authorities believed to be moral correction, not just punishing the offender, but allowing society to vent its collective anger at the violation of its moral codes. In many regions, the woman was forced to wear some kind of symbol of her crime. This could be a wooden sign hung around her neck with the word adulteress, or a crude drawing of two hearts pierced by a dagger. Sometimes she was made to carry a broom or a bundle of sticks, mocking her role as a failed housekeeper and wife. In certain German towns, adulterers were paraded while sitting backward on a donkey, a symbolic gesture of foolishness and moral inversion. For a woman who had once held her head high, walking through these same streets to visit friends or shop at the market, this reversal was devastating. The mechanics of the parade were not accidental. They were planned to maximize the distance, the time, and the public exposure. Some towns had specific routes designed for shaming. These routes passed through the busiest areas. the market square, the churchyard, the main gate of the town. The woman would often be accompanied by guards or town criers who shouted her crime aloud at each intersection. In some places, drums or bells would be sounded during her walk, drawing even more people to watch. There was no hiding, no way to slip quietly through the ordeal. The entire point was to make sure that everyone, from the lowest peasant to the richest merchant, knew of her disgrace. One particularly chilling account from Nuremberg in the 15th century describes how a woman caught with a lover was forced to walk the length of the city wall while being pelted with rotten eggs. Her husband, granted the right to oversee the punishment, followed behind, ensuring she did not try to cover herself or hide her face. The records note that the woman's hair had been cut to the scalp, and her face was smeared with ashes to make her appear ugly and unworthy. This was not only a punishment, but a public performance of moral judgment, where the community collectively declared her unfit as a wife and as a member of decent society. The crowd's role was both active and symbolic. Medieval society believed that public involvement made justice stronger as the community itself witnessed the correction of sin. People were expected to react, either by throwing things, shouting insults, or simply watching with stern, disapproving faces. Silence was rare. In some towns, failing to attend public punishments was frowned upon, as if you were neglecting your duty to uphold the moral order. It was a grim form of entertainment, a way for ordinary people to feel righteous by condemning someone else's weakness. The psychological toll on the punished woman was immense. To be stripped, exposed, and paraded in front of neighbors was not just a momentary embarrassment. It was the destruction of her identity. In a time when reputation meant everything, especially for women whose social roles were tied to chastity and honor, this kind of public disgrace could ruin a life forever. Even if she returned home after the ordeal, she would be marked, whispered about, and often shunned. Her shaved head, taking months to grow back, served as a constant reminder of her crime. It was like a scar etched onto her body by the community itself. These parades were not confined to women alone. Men who committed adultery could also be subjected to public shaming, though often the punishments were lighter. In some regions, an adulterous man might be forced to wear women's clothing and walk through the streets as a mockery of his masculinity. In Florence, there are records of men being made to carry symbolic objects like wooden phalluses or brooms while being laughed at by crowds. Yet, even with these humiliations, men were often able to recover their reputation more easily than women. A man's infidelity was sometimes excused as a moment of weakness, while a woman's was seen as a deep, unforgivable betrayal. One of the most brutal aspects of these public punishments was how they turned private pain into communal spectacle. A marriage, already shattered by betrayal, became a public drama. Husbands sometimes stood in a crowd, watching as their wives were humiliated or even participated by leading the parade themselves. In some towns, a husband who refused to publicly punish his adulterous wife was viewed as weak or dishonorable. There are even cases where husbands insisted on harsher punishments, not because the law demanded it, but because they felt their personal honor had been soiled. The church, too, played a complex role in these rituals. While some priests advocated for forgiveness and penance in private, others supported public humiliation as a way to cleanse the community. Religious ceremonies sometimes followed the parade, with the woman forced to kneel in front of the church door, begging for absolution. In certain regions, she was required to wear penitential clothing, a rough gray garment with a rope belt, and attend services while sitting apart from the rest of the congregation. Her shaved head and penitential garb marked her as a sinner, visible to all, until a priest deemed her forgiven. The spectacle of public shaming could also turn violent. There are documented cases where the crowd's anger boiled over, resulting in severe injuries or even death. A woman in Strasbourg in the 14th century was so badly beaten by townsfolk during her parade that she died a few days later. Authorities often looked the other way in such cases, reasoning that the community had simply expressed its will against immorality. It is worth noting that these punishments were not always carried out under formal legal procedures. In smaller villages, accusations of adultery could lead to spontaneous acts of mob justice. Neighbors might drag a woman out of her home, shave her head themselves, and parade her without any official decree. These vigilante punishments were sometimes more brutal than the legal ones, as they were driven by personal grudges, gossip, or jealousy. A mere rumor of infidelity could be enough to trigger such an ordeal, leaving innocent women vulnerable to the whims of the crowd. The contrast between urban and rural practices is also fascinating. In larger cities, the parades were often more organized, with officials and guards ensuring that the punishment followed a set route and did not descend into chaos. In rural areas, however, the process could be chaotic, fueled by the raw emotions of the villagers. Whether controlled or chaotic, the message was the same. Adultery would not be tolerated, and the offender's shame must be visible to all. By the end of such a parade, the woman would be broken, both physically and emotionally. Her journey through the town streets was not just a walk, it was a slow dismantling of her humanity. Every step, every jeer, every splatter of mud reinforced her isolation. Even when the parade ended, the shame lingered. She might return home to a husband who despised her, children who were too young to understand but old enough to feel the stigma, and neighbors who would never look at her the same way again. Yet, these parades served a purpose in the medieval mind. They reinforced the idea that morality was a communal responsibility. By witnessing and participating in the humiliation of one sinner, the entire community felt purified, as if the public exposure of one person's sin could cleanse the collective soul. It was a dark form of social cohesion, binding people together through shared judgment and cruelty. In the next part, we will explore one particularly infamous case of public shaming, a story that reveals not just the brutality of the punishment, but also the twisted sense of justice that allowed entire towns to revel in another's humiliation. We will also examine how these punishments influenced the lives of those who survived them, leaving scars that no one could see, but everyone could feel. The year was 1377 in the small but bustling town of Rouen, France. Market day had drawn villagers from miles around, filling the square with the clamor of bargaining voices and the scent of fresh bread and livestock. Yet, on this particular morning, the usual chatter was replaced by an electric tension. News had spread like wildfire. A lady of noble blood had been discovered in the arms of her servant. For days, whispers had swirled through the narrow streets, each retelling more lurid than the last, until the scandal reached the ears of the town's bailiff. In medieval France, such a betrayal was not only a personal shame for her husband, but a public affront to his honor. And honor in this age was everything. The woman's name was Isabeau. She was young, strikingly beautiful, and married to a wealthy merchant who often traveled for trade. Her loneliness, it was said, led her into the arms of a stable hand, a man of coarse hands and broad shoulders. When they were caught together one night in the stables, there was no chance for escape, no way to deny it. The law was swift, but her husband's decision was even swifter. He would not kill her, but he would see her dignity destroyed. He wanted her to become an example, a warning to every woman who might dare to bring disgrace upon her household. At dawn, the procession began. Isabeau was dragged from her home, her fine garments ripped from her body, until she stood in a thin linen shift. Her long dark hair, which had once been her pride, was cut away in rough handfuls by the town barber. As each lock fell to the ground, the crowd gasped and murmured, some with pity, most with judgment. Children giggled, pointing at her, while older women muttered curses or crossed themselves in silent prayer. The barber worked quickly, leaving her scalp raw and uneven, a cruel crown of humiliation. The stable hand, meanwhile, received a different fate. He was tied to a post and given 20 lashes with a whip, his back bleeding under the force of the blows. After his punishment, he was released with a fine, free to leave town and start anew elsewhere. For Isabeau, there would be no such reprieve. A rope was tied around her waist, and a wooden board with the word adulteress in crude black letters was hung around her neck. Guards grabbed her arms, pulling her toward the main square where a crowd had gathered. Bells were rung, not to announce mass or market hours, but to summon every villager to witness her shame. Isabeau's bare feet stumbled over the uneven stones, already bruised and cut by the rough streets. The parade began at the church, where the priest stood waiting. Before she was marched through the streets, Isabeau was forced to kneel on the cold steps of the church and confess her sin aloud, her voice trembling as she begged for God's forgiveness. The priest offered a prayer, but his tone was as stern as the stares of the villagers surrounding her. Let this be a lesson to all, he declared, that sin brings not only the wrath of heaven, but the scorn of your neighbors. From the church, the guards pulled her through the marketplace. Every merchant paused their trade to watch, some shouting insults, others spitting at her feet. Rotten vegetables, collected by mischievous children for this very purpose, flew through the air, splattering against her bare shoulders. Mud clung to her shift, soaking it until it became translucent, revealing the shape of her body to the jeering crowd. Each step felt like an eternity, each face another knife cutting into what remained of her pride. Some accounts say that during such parades, husbands walked behind their wives, holding a whip or a stick as a sign that they had reclaimed control. In Isabeau's case, her husband walked in silence, his expression cold and unyielding. He did not look at her, nor did he intervene when stones and filth were hurled at her by the angriest villagers. In the eyes of the town, this was his right. She had betrayed him, and now he was the aggrieved party, the man reclaiming his honor. The route wound through every major street of Rouen, ensuring that no one could miss the spectacle. Isabeau's tears mixed with the dirt on her cheeks, and her sobs were drowned out by the laughter and shouting around her. What once might have been a private tragedy, a marriage broken by betrayal, had become a communal ritual of shame. Even those who did not know her personally joined in, throwing insults as if her humiliation was a form of entertainment. As the procession neared its end, she was brought back to the marketplace, where the final act awaited her. A wooden platform had been erected, and she was forced to climb onto it, standing for an hour while the townspeople filed past, staring and mocking. This hour, known as the Hour of Penance, was meant to allow every villager a chance to see her disgrace with their own eyes. The shaved head, the torn clothing, the sign around her neck, all of it worked together to strip away any last vestige of dignity she might have held. When the hour was finally over, Isabeau was released, but the damage had been done. She returned to her home, if it could still be called hers, with no friends to comfort her, no sympathetic faces in the crowd. Her marriage was effectively over, even if the law said otherwise. Her husband refused to speak to her, and within weeks, she was sent to live with distant relatives, far from the town that had once been her home. For the people of Rouen, the matter was settled, but for Isabeau, the scars would never fade. She would carry them, invisible yet heavy, for the rest of her life. Stories like Isabeau's were not unique. Across medieval Europe, countless women suffered similar fates. In Germany, there are records of women paraded naked through the streets with iron collars around their necks, bells attached so that everyone could hear them coming. In England, some women were made to wear the infamous scold's bridle, a metal contraption that locked their mouth shut, forcing them into silence as they were marched through town. In Italy, adulterous women might be forced to stand on bridges or in public squares, holding heavy stones as a sign of their guilt. What is striking is how these punishments combine physical discomfort with psychological torment. Being whipped or fined was painful, but the shame of being exposed, laughed at, and degraded in front of the entire community left wounds that went much deeper. In a time when social standing was everything, to lose one's honor was to lose one's place in the world. Even today, the image of a woman with her head forcibly shaved carries echoes of these medieval practices. During times of war, such as in World War II, women accused of collaborating with occupying forces were publicly shaven and paraded, just as their medieval counterparts were centuries earlier. The symbolism remains powerful. Shaving the head is not just about altering appearance, but about stripping away identity, reducing a person to an object of ridicule and scorn. Looking back, we might ask, were these punishments truly about justice, or were they about control? The church and local authorities claimed that public shaming was necessary to maintain moral order, but it is clear that these spectacles also serve to reinforce power structures, particularly the control of men over women. By humiliating women so publicly, society ensured that others would think twice before challenging the rigid expectations of chastity and obedience. The story of Isabeau and countless others reminds us of how fragile personal freedom was in the Middle Ages, especially for women. Their lives, reputations, and even their bodies was subject to the scrutiny and judgment of the community. Adultery was treated not just as a private failing, but as a public crime that demanded a collective response. The parade, the shaved head, the jeers. These were tools not only of punishment, but of social conditioning. As we close this chapter, imagine the silence that follows such a parade. The crowd disperses, the guards return to their posts, and the punished woman is left alone with her thoughts. The echo of insult still rings in her ears, the cold air still bites at her skin. Somewhere in a quiet corner of the town, she sits and weeps, knowing that no amount of time will erase what has been done. Her life has been rewritten by the judgment of others, her name forever tied to shame. But these stories are not just relics of the past. They force us to confront uncomfortable truths about how societies, even today, use public humiliation as a weapon. Whether through medieval parades or modern social media, the instinct to shame and destroy someone's reputation has not disappeared. It has simply changed form. And so, as we look back on these brutal practices of the Middle Ages, we must ask ourselves, what is the true cost of a justice that thrives on spectacle and humiliation? For Isabeau, and for countless women like her, that cost was everything.